Welcome to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, the podcast about learning and work after high school, brought to you by Lumina Foundation. I'm your host, Dakota Palicki. Each year, nearly 2 million people take the SAT to prove they're college ready. This standardized exam is intended to objectively measure a student's ability to do well in college. And since its creation in the 1920s, a student's score has been used in college admissions, scholarship awards, and even employment decisions. For decades, scholars, practitioners, and policymakers have questioned both the objectivity of the test and its ability to predict college success. Some research shows that the test is biased against Black and Hispanic students and students from low-income neighborhoods. Defenders of the test say the test itself is not biased, though. Instead, they argue that how the results of the test are used by colleges, particularly the weight the score has in admissions decisions, is where bias occurs. In addition to the issues of racial and ethnic bias, there are several other debates about the SAT. Who has access to test preparation services like tutoring, and how influential are those services on boosting a student's score? Does everyone have equal access to the test, or do wealthy students have an advantage by being able to afford to take the test multiple times? How much K-12 curriculum should focus on what is being tested? When is it too early to take the test? Freshman year, 7th grade? Perhaps the most important question is, how are the results of the test used? This decades-old debate has picked up new steam recently as a group of advocacy organizations filed a lawsuit against the University of California system in December of 2019. The lawsuit argues that the system's admissions requirement to submit an SAT or ACT score is illegal, unconstitutional, and discriminatory. To help us learn more about this case, I'm joined by Elissa Nadworny, reporter and editor for NPR's education team. Elissa, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm glad that you have some time to be with us and tell us a little bit more about this case.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So help us understand what is the case about, who's involved?
Yeah, so the lawsuit that was filed in December was a pro bono law firm. So it's called Public Counsel, and they represented students and advocacy organizations, basically saying that the University of California system is using the SAT and the ACT in college admissions unlawfully. So basically, it doesn't treat all students equal under California law. So that's what the lawsuit lays out. Their main objective here is to have the University of California system remove standardized tests like the ACT and the SAT from the college admissions process.
So can you tell us a little bit about why this lawsuit came up now? I mean, this has been a debate that's been going on for decades, and it seems that now was the appropriate time.
So the University of California system is kind of in this period of transition. So they've been thinking about this for a long time. So I'll give you a little history of kind of the standardized tests in California. Back in the 60s, they were one of the school systems. They weren't the first, but they were a big system that said, yes, we're going to take the SAT in college admissions. They were lobbied really hard by the College Board to do this. And kind of once the state system in California did it, it set a national trend, essentially. I mean, a lot of schools followed suit. So even back then, people in California were like, is this a good idea? There was some dissent within the system, professors, researchers that said, actually, this shouldn't be required in admissions. And so honestly, even since then, there's been decades of folks saying, is this right? Just last year, they decided to establish a task force to look into the use of standardized tests in the California system. So the lawsuit kind of comes in the middle of a lot of kind of reconsidering of this. And of course, this is happening nationally, this idea of like, is the test important? You know, we can talk a little bit more about test optional, that movement. You know, about 1,000 schools have gone test optional. So California's been thinking about this just this year. They start the task force. The lawsuit comes in right at this moment to say, hey, if you weren't already going to do this, we think we have legal grounds to force you to stop using the tests.
Sounds like a little bit of extra encouragement, perhaps, to get the task force moving. You know, is it really, they cite that it's, unconstitutional, unfair. Is that mainly on the basis of racial and ethnic disparities as the way the test is? Is it about SES? What is it, the kind of issue?
The complaint shows research demonstrating inequalities both racially, demographically, and socioeconomically. What's interesting in this complaint is they're kind of saying this isn't new. Like, this is all of the research that we've had on this. They're kind of putting it in one place and adding a legal argument to it. It's no longer kind of, is this fair? Is this legally allowed to be done? One of the things that really struck me was I talked with one of the attorneys behind the case, Mark Rosenbaum, and he said the point isn't to go to trial. He doesn't want this case to actually see a courtroom. The goal would be for the system to drop the test. That's the point of the case.
Mm-hmm. And if the University of California system does drop the test, you said earlier that back in the 60s it kind of set this national norm. Do we expect them to also kind of drive the nation in this way too?
Well, I think that's why a lot of eyes are on California, right? Because they're not the first system or the first university to get rid of the test. About 1,000 schools have, including schools like the University of Chicago, American University in DC, lots of smaller liberal arts schools like Bates College. They've gone test optional, so the test isn't required. There's some issues there that we can talk about. What's test optional versus totally getting rid of the test. Those two are certainly different things. But yeah, all eyes are on California, I think, just because of its size and because of the role that it played in kind of adopting the test as a national standard. There's still a long way to go. The University of California system is a bureaucracy, so there's a lot of layers, even this task force. And then once the task force decides what to do, they recommend it to the academic senate. So there's a lot of steps in place that would need to happen to make this official.
Yeah, I mean, and the sheer size of the California system alone.
Big system.
Yeah, very large. So where is the case at? I know you mentioned that they're not hoping to go to trial, but where is it at now? Where are we expecting it to go?
Yeah, so I spoke to the lawyers behind the case this weekend, and they said they're kind of in this holding pattern because they're waiting to see what happens with the special task force. They're waiting to see what the university said. They've, of course, been in talks with folks in the system, but there haven't really been any major developments. So it's like this. It's in this waiting game.
Mm-hmm. And do you know to what extent? Obviously the University of California system includes all UC schools, but do you expect that maybe one UC school will branch off and kind of do something against, or is this truly a system level kind of solution?
Yeah, I think that's the conversation that's happening now. And I think from the folks I've talked to within the system, they want it to be system wide. The folks who lead, say, Berkeley, have come out publicly and said, we actually don't believe in this test. We don't think we should use it. But that hasn't been enough. I think that's kind of the power of the UC system, probably also the frustration, I would imagine, is that they're trying to kind of move as one. I think one of the big questions that's come up that they're thinking about is when you get rid of the test, do you have enough without it? Right? One of the kind of arguments for the test is that it's standardized, right? Like that it's in the title. And so people argue that it's one of the few things that you can really compare across the board. We talk about grades. Research has shown grades can possibly be a better predictor for college success. But of course, there are issues of grade inflation, but not just that. What classes are offered at which schools? What's the rigor within those classes? And so kind of the argument for the test, of course, is that it provides this standard look. If you get rid of that, is it enough? What do you use? In California, there's conversations around the Smarter Balance test, which is kind of the Common Core aligned test that's in high schools. Lots of students are already taking this test. There's a bit of research that says it's just as good of a predictor for college success as an SAT or an ACT. Of course, the challenge is right now, there's not stakes. There's not college stakes attached to that test. So if they were to shift over to something like the Smarter Balance test, how would that change? Would it become more like the SAT? Would it mimic some of those inequities or inequalities because there are stakes, attached to it?
Yeah, well, it seems like there's of course, the debate rages on. It's exciting to have you on the beat and reporting on this. I really have enjoyed following your reporting. And again, thank you so much for joining us today and getting us in the room a bit.
Yeah, of course.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks. You don't have more stuff for me? I can talk about this all day.
I mean, hey, if you got more, we'll take it. I think,
Yeah.
but it is one of these things that it's just, as I was saying, it's when you start digging into all of this, there are so many different policy prescriptions around this, and the debate about do we even need something that is standardized, I think, is also at the heart of this. We know that 65% of all the jobs currently need some kind of post-secondary education, right? Whether that's trade school, college, 4-year. We're not just talking about degrees, and so does it even make sense for us to even have to have something that's standardized to compare a student from a student, or instead, can we just be a little bit more holistic and make sure that someone is going to be entering a post-secondary pathway that they're going to be successful at, and is that satisfactory enough?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that the SAT and the ACT are so ingrained in K through 12. I mean, the College Board and the ACT have done such a good job of making those deals with states, getting them into kind of high school curriculum. Some states are even evaluating whether or not they should be graduation requirements. Mm-hmm. And so I think this idea of even a university system as large as California getting rid of the test, is that enough to exit it from our college admission system? I mean, that's kind of the question around these test optional schools. Yeah. If you can still submit the test, if it's just optional, you would think it actually may have an outsized role in the process. Super interesting stuff. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. And we'll continue to watch your reporting. And thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Bye. Have a good one. Welcome back. There are many that argue that grades are much more predictive of college success than SAT scores. Dr. Elaine Allensworth, director of University of Chicago's Consortium on School Research, examined this question in a recent working paper and is here to share a bit about what she found. Elaine, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to talk with you again.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So, just tell us a little bit about what you examined in your working paper.
Yeah. So, we've been studying what matters for student success in college for a long time here at the UChicago Consortium. And my colleagues and I continually find that students' high school GPA is incredibly predictive of how they do in college. It's potentially a great indicator that high schools can use. It's also potentially the best strategy for thinking about how to better prepare students by really looking at their GPAs and trying to encourage students to do better in their classes. But every time we present this research, every single time, the first question that we get is, but aren't GPAs subjective? Nobody trusts GPAs because, they're not seen as reliable. And almost immediately the follow-up will be, well, really we should look at test scores because they have the same meaning across different schools. And they say this without any evidence out there about whether test scores have the same meaning across schools. So we decided, let's look at that. Let's see how much more variable high school GPAs are as indicators of college readiness than ACT scores. And what we found was, yes, students with the same GPA will have a higher likelihood of graduating college depending on which high school they go to. But you could say the same thing about their ACT scores. Students with the same ACT score will have a higher likelihood of graduating depending on which high school they went to. There are these high school effects that are, that increase the likelihood of graduating for students with the same achievement. And we found that high school GPA is an incredibly strong predictor of how students do in college, no matter which high school they attend. And in fact, the relationship is remarkably similar. Regardless of what high school you go to, you basically get the same increase in your odds of graduating college for each higher increment of high school GPA that you have. And that's not true for ACT scores. In fact, at a lot of schools, ACT scores weren't even predictive of how students would do in college once you control for the kinds of colleges that students attend. And even the relationship even becomes negative at the higher levels of ACT. So here you have test scores seen as this consistent indicator of college readiness, when actually it's not consistent at all depending on which high school a student goes to. While GPAs are very consistent and they're much, much stronger predictors, about 4 times more predictive than ACT scores on average. Actually, more than 4 times as predictive.
Wow, that's incredible. So to recap, what I think I just heard you say is that GPA scores are not only much more predictive of a student's success in college than, say, an ACT score, but that the GPA is much more predictive irrespective of which high school you go to. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Wow.
So regardless of high school you're at, working to support students so they're getting stronger grades is a stronger strategy for improving readiness for college than working to get higher test scores. And in fact, you might get no returns to higher test scores. The one benefit that we saw from higher test scores is that students are more likely to go to more selective colleges. The more, the higher their test scores are. And of course, that's because test scores are used as a signal to colleges and to students, even though they're not all that predictive of how students actually perform in terms of their likelihood of graduating.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and you already mentioned, I mean, like, I know as I was digging in preparation for the show and reading some additional research and commentary, I mean, there's just so many myths and opinions about, about college admission, about SAT and ACT and grades. And, but, I really take your point earlier that there really hasn't been a lot of true research around this topic. There's just a lot of noise, if you will. Yeah. And I guess, one of the things that keeps coming up when we talk about grades as a potential predictor or, college admission criteria is people get worried about grade inflation, that an A at this school over there is actually a C at this school. But I believe that you all have looked into grade inflation before. Can you talk to a little bit about what you know about grade inflation?
Yeah, it does exist. I mean, it is harder to get high grades at schools with higher achieving students. And we see that in this study, we see it, and we've seen it in other studies as well. The question that becomes is that difference, is that greater than the signal that you get from GPAs overall? And it's not. Actually, the signal from students' GPA is stronger than that variation that occurs because it's harder to get high grades at some schools than others.
The difference is not between an A and a B. The difference is between like an A plus and an A minus. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah, I would say the difference is about, we say, a half of a GPA point. So between a minus and a B plus. At the extremes, you get larger differences. But again, if you look at, what's more important, the overall GPA versus where they go to school, the overall GPA is a stronger predictor. Mm-hmm. You can look at the average achievement of students' school to kind of adjust for that. And that's actually a better adjustment than looking at students' individual ACT scores. So a student's individual ACT score doesn't really improve your prediction of whether they're going to graduate from college over their GPA. But if you look at the college graduation rates of students' high schools or the achievement level of students' high schools, that will give you a better indicator because there are these high school effects, which says where students go to high school actually matters for college beyond any effect on their individual achievement. Yeah. And some of that could be more rigorous programs at some schools than other schools. It could be better support for college at some high schools than others. And it can also be families with more resources are more likely to send their students to particular high schools and then support them in college.
Yeah, and so, I guess one of the criticisms of the SAT that we hear, and certainly as part of the litigation out in University of California, is that there's certainly a racial and an ethnic bias sometimes that people are citing. But I also hear that there's clearly some that race and ethnicity and socioeconomics also play into account where you attend school. And so did your paper at all cover the weight of those two biases, I guess is what I'm asking, are we overly concerned about, is the test more objective because it doesn't account for where you go to school, or are grades still a better predictor that kind of control for that element?
This is a concern because there is a strong relationship between test scores and students' economic status. We see it in our data, actually. The relationship between school average test scores and school average SES is very high. In fact, we can't even put the two variables together in a model in a statistical model because they cancel each other out. So if we're relying on test scores as measures of college readiness, it's going to be really hard for schools that are serving low-income students to look like they're successful, even if they really are successful. So we really need to have other indicators, I think, of how well schools are preparing students for college. You know, in Chicago, for example, and in other places around the country, people are actually tracking how well students do in college and then giving that information back to high schools and using that information to make decisions at a policy level. That is going to be much better information than average test scores. Right now, most of almost every state in the country has college readiness as one of its goals, one of the goals of the state education agency. Pretty much every state. And in pretty much every state, they measure progress towards those goals with standardized test scores, oftentimes ACT, SAT. If there's not a strong relationship between test scores and how students do in college, they're really not getting any information or hardly any information on how well they're progressing towards those goals, right? And then they may not make good decisions when they use the test score data to evaluate policies and programs.
And it certainly seems that under those kinds of policies, then schools with students from lower SES backgrounds are likely to be more punished, right? If they're using, since the correlation between ACT, SAT scores are so well correlated, versus if they change something to more predictive, like grades, for example, they might actually account for a school's meaningful achievement and growth.
That's another thing we haven't talked a lot about, but just how test scores are used as gatekeepers so often. And if they're not actually all that predictive, then we're using a metric that we know is highly associated with students' economic background to make decisions about who gets into particular programs. You know, this is a little bit off topic, but one thing that, people get, they don't really believe these findings a lot of times because the test scores seem so neutral, right? And they seem like they should matter so much, right? Because students need to take tests when they go to college. They need skills in math and English language arts, which is what is measured on these tests. And everyone takes the test under the same circumstances, right? But the fact is, they're not neutral, right? Tests measure only a very small part of what students, a small portion of what students need to know in college, where students need to have, much more general knowledge across many different topic areas, many different kinds of skills, not just being able to take a one-time high-stakes test. And they need to show consistent effort over an entire semester, an entire school year, right, in many different formats, right? And so even though they're measuring the same thing, they selected a very small set of what students need to know. And then because of that, it's also easier to kind of, to kind of over-prepare, right, for that one metric. And we see this. We see some students taking all of these ACT and SAT prep classes, right? And they'll take them over and over again. And families with lots of resources will have their students take the test over and over again until they get the score that they want, right? I remember learning, I was so shocked, learning there were students who were freshmen in high school who already were taking test prep classes so they could just keep, trying until, when they were juniors, they had now taken the test so many times, they had, all of these scores to choose from. And so people look at that as sometimes they say, oh, this, tests provide meritocracy because you can work really hard, get a high test score, and show that you put in all this effort. But because they're so narrow, you can put in lots of effort and resources in a very narrow way that then isn't going to necessarily translate into doing better when you get to college.
Yeah, I mean, so one, I'll say that I love that this notion that the reason that we rely or all believe in the test so much is because we universally all hate it. And that's me putting words in your mouth a little bit, but there's something sociological there about if it's a great equalizer if we all don't like it. And I also think what you're touching on is that grades also are probably more predictive, and this is something I'm just throwing out here, of other non-cognitive skills as already. Like you mentioned, a grade is earned over a much longer period of time, and that includes showing up to class, absenteeism. We know there's a lot of studies out there about how often grades are also used to grade behavior and not just academic achievement. Which is another topic for another day, but certainly it seems that that grades might be actually more predictive of other kind of or rather, the grades are probably more reflective of a person's entirety rather than someone individually. And I think it was funny. Just a couple days ago, I was talking to somebody who their 7th grader was taking the SAT. And so it's astonishing to me. Yeah, it's astonishing to me how early, to your point, that we really get people into the test taking, funnel, not only just for prep classes, but also so you have a series of scores that you can choose from later on. So it seems that we've gone really kind of nuts about the testing craze a bit.
Yeah, and students hate it too. I mean, it's so boring, right? Preparing for these tests. And so think about all the time they're spending doing this. If they could actually be, becoming, they could be doing things that they're excited about, or learning more about the world than just learning how to take these tests. And it just narrows the focus so much. You think about how wide the world is and how much there is to learn, and then students just get so bored and turned off from all of this test taking and all of the studying, take all these different kinds of tests. Mm-hmm. It just feels like it's a waste, and it's, I don't think it can be good for students.
Yeah.
And I do think that the reason grades are so much more predictive than test scores is because they are such comprehensive measures of students' performance in school across many different topic areas, many different kinds of classes, many different skills, including non-cognitive skills, and mindsets and learning strategies, perseverance, all these kinds of things. They measure more of the totality of the student, and they do it in different ways. I actually think that it's because grades measure different things, because they're not measuring exactly the same thing over and over again, that they're very predictive. Because life isn't the same thing over and over again. College courses are not going to be the same thing over again. When you go to college, you're expected to have broad content knowledge. You're supposed to be able to write well and argue your points. You have to come to class and get your assignments done. And you're going to have teachers who expect different things from you. And so I think by having teachers who are teaching you, very different skills, very different content, and have different expectations, you're learning, it's helping you become a better learner, because you're becoming, deeper, broader in lots of different ways, and you're getting a better measure of how students are doing, because you're asking them, you're seeing how they do in different kinds of challenges under different kinds of conditions. So you get this much more comprehensive measure of how they're doing. The problem isn't that GPAs are so variable. The problem is that, test scores are so narrow in terms of what they're measuring.
So, before we wrap up, I'm curious, I know this study focused primarily on those entering 4-year colleges. Are you interested in looking at 2-year colleges, technical colleges, other post-secondary options as well?
Yeah, so actually, my colleagues here at the UChicago Consortium are doing just that. They're looking at 2-year college outcomes. It's much more complicated because, if a student's enrolling in a 4-year college, they want to get a bachelor's degree. If a student enrolls in a 2-year college, a lot of times we don't know what the outcome is that they want to get. And so we're trying to figure out how to study that.
And I know this working paper is about to be published someplace. Where can people expect to find it pretty soon?
Yeah, an educational researcher. It should be out in the next couple of months.
And in the meantime, if people are wanting to check it out right away, where can they go and find it?
They can look at our website. It's UChicago.consortium.edu.
Wonderful. And we'll be sure to link to it in the show notes. Well, Dr. Allensworth, thank you so much for joining us today and talking a little bit about your study and your research. And we're going to continue to stay in touch and see what you and your colleagues continue to produce for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You bet. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
So what is the debate about the SAT really about? At the end of the day, it's about making sure people have access to opportunities to achieve their full potential. Across the country, there are many colleges that have implemented test-optional policies. These schools are using multiple measures assessment, which takes grades, school and community engagement, and other factors into admissions decisions. There are others that argue that the SAT should be provided universally and free to all students to take as many times as they need, and that the admissions criteria should weight a student's score properly. Whatever the solution, we should remain determined to update the policies used to determine college entrance with the nation's need for talent. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Please take a moment to subscribe and rate the show. And if you have an idea or a comment, you can reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter @DakotaPolicki. See you next time.